My background, I suppose that could be looked at several different ways. One of them is kind of my growing up experiences, and then there's my professional background. I think some of my relevant background is thinking about my childhood was that my father was a out-of-control alcoholic until toward the latter third of his life when he became active in AA, and things went well for him after that. And I've been thinking about it in my family. My maternal aunt was an alcoholic for most of her life, as were at least one of her children. So I certainly have it in my family, and that's one of the reasons why I frankly avoided being involved in substance abuse treatment for some years, and I sort of took it up later in my career. I was born in Corsicana, Texas, which is about 70 miles south of Dallas. I moved around a fair amount. It was before they had preschool. I didn't live in Corsicana very long. And we lived in a little place called Price, Utah. It's a mining town, coal mining. And but that was before I went to school. I went to the first grade in Colorado Springs, and after that we moved to California. And I lived in Santa Maria, California, and went through grades 2 through 5, and then moved to Orange County, California, where I went through junior high and high school. I did not have an illustrious high school career. I didn't wake up until my senior year. I was able to go to Long Beach State College for a couple of years. I then went to actually the University of Madrid. There was I had been accepted at the University of California, Berkeley, but I delayed that for a year because I discovered there was a program in Hispanic Studies at the University of Madrid. As kind of a lark, I applied, I was accepted, and I went there. It was a wonderful year studying in Madrid, then came back and finished up, got my bachelor's degree at Berkeley, and then did my master's and doctoral work at the University of California, Riverside. I graduated from Cal Berkeley in '65. I didn't get my doctorate until 1972, but I had already in 1970 I went to teach at Howard University, and I was there for 10 years. So I finished my dissertation while I was teaching at Howard University. Yes.
60s and 70s.
Yeah, 60s and 70s. Right. It was sex, drug, rock and roll. Yes, it did. You know, I was. Well, first of all, as an undergraduate, I did some binge drinking, but I might be a slow learner, but I was a learner, so I didn't have a big problem with alcohol. However, when I was in graduate school, there was a large number of my friends who were taking psychedelic drugs. And I watched them, and they didn't seem to lose any of their skills or commitment. And so I became an active explorer in drugs, taking LSD and mescaline and drugs like that. And for me, it was a very positive experience. I felt like, still feel that I never had a bad trip. I felt like I came to understand my place on it was like a religious experience. And to this day, I don't think that those psychedelic drugs are handled in the appropriate ways. And it's not something that I talk very much about with my colleagues in substance abuse treatment and prevention. Yes, so I'm enrolled in the Citizen Potawatomi Nation. Potawatomi have about 18 different bands. The tribe originated in the Newfoundland area of Canada. And there are 3 tribes that speak basically the same languages and have similar customs. And it's the Ojibwa, the Potawatomi, and the Odawa. Translated into English, Odawa is the Ottawa tribe. all three tribes moved in a westerly direction over hundreds of years, and the primary area of the Potawatomi tribe is all around Lake Michigan. We have more treaties with the United States than any other treaty. That's one reason why there's so many bands. So there's a Forest County Potawatomi in Wisconsin, for example, and there's a Prairie Band Potawatomi in Nebraska or Iowa, I forget which. And the Citizen Band, we were the last to move. We were moved to Oklahoma, which was Indian territory, and we were called Citizen Band because part of the last treaty accorded citizenship in the United States to the band when we moved to Oklahoma. A lot of people don't know that many American Indians from federally recognized tribes didn't become citizens of the United States until the 20s, where there's the Indian Citizenship Act was passed. But some tribes had treaties that granted citizenship to the United States, and that's why we're called the Citizen Band. I was in my 40s when I started doing it, and it really derived from the work in Indian country, because substance abuse prevention and treatment are big in Indian country. You know, most tribes, before the contact with Europeans, the way I understand it is that it was only tribes in the Southwest that had peyote and agave, and but other tribes hadn't distilled spirits, and so alcoholism for the most part was unknown in Indian country, certainly in my tribe, until contact with the Europeans. And after that, it has become a big problem for many reasons, and I actually was working in the area of Indian health and saw the problem and then started becoming active in it. My belief is that one of the major problems in Indian country is the lack of employment. Everybody just about knows about the Great Depression, and the Great Depression unemployment rates got maybe close to 30%. And there's a lot of reservations and places in Indian country where unemployment has been over 50% for decades. What happened to most tribes is that there was a treaty signed, and the treaty brought an end to hostilities. There was a war going on. And so the treaty called for cessation of hostilities, and then a section of the country that was reserved for the tribe only, and no one else. It was, and there's tribal sovereignty over those areas, and not surprisingly, if you know much history, the areas where tribes were moved weren't the most desirable areas, and so. On top of that, I mean, this is a long story, but kind of the shortened version is that there were certain periods in the United States after the 1850s and through 1900s, early 1900s, Indian children were forcibly removed from their families and sent to residential schools, and the idea was, literally, he says, kill the Indian, save the child. And so in those schools, those boarding schools, they were forcibly removed. And I know many people whose parents and grandparents went through that process of being removed, ran away from school, came back home, were picked up again, and went back to the boarding schools. They weren't allowed to practice their cultural, religious practices. They weren't allowed to speak their languages, and they did learn English and some trade skills. It wasn't all bad, but there was a lot of child abuse that went in, child abuse and neglect that went in to those things. So one of the things that resulted in was kind of parentless parents. You know, when they came back, they were not socialized in the family the way they would have been had they not been removed. So in many reservations, there's the loss of the native language, or a struggle to maintain it, a loss of the practices, the cultural practices, and the tribal economy was ruined. Like the Plains Indians had buffalo, and the buffalo were basically wiped out. Other tribes were more hunter and gathering, and the new reservation didn't allow them to be productively involved in their traditional ways. So I think that the Protestants got it right, which is idle hands, devil's work, you know. So when you're on a reservation and there's not much there, there's no job opportunities. Those are the kinds of, there's huge poverty, there's the loss of the traditions, then there's the loss of the family experience, being taken off to boarding schools. All of those things put together make it very difficult to find a job, and if you don't have a job, now to look at the brighter side, all of that's changing. And interestingly enough, as during my lifetime, it happened during the Nixon administration. And while I think Nixon is rightly disparaged for criminal acts that he did, one of the good things that he did was help revive tribal sovereignty. And so that started what's called the government-to-government relationships between sovereign Indian tribes in the United States of America. And that then grew into, Congress passed the Indian Education and Self-Determination Act in the late 50s or 60s, and that has allowed tribes used to get their services from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which kind of acted like the entire federal government in Indian country, you know. So they built roads, they built schools, they provided health care until it got so bad it was switched to the Department of Health and Human Services, the Indian Health Service. Well, that public law and it has enabled tribes to take over all of those services. So now tribes, including mine, they have their own police force, they have their own hospital, their own healthcare system, and so forth. And that is revolutionary because it's providing jobs in Indian country. And my view is jobs is one of the key requirements of a holistic approach to dealing with substance abuse prevention and treatment. Absolutely, it's changing. First of all, the federal government gets credit for spending a lot of money and a lot of resources to deal with health problems in general and substance abuse in particular in Indian country. By the way, I had mentioned there's an organization in the federal government. It's called the Indian Health Service. It's part of the United States Public Health Service. American Indians living on or near reservations get free health care. And you might ask, why is it that Indians get health care free and Hispanics and Asians and other minority groups don't? And the reason for that is that the relationship between the United States of America and Indian tribes is not racial, it's political. There were treaties between Indian tribes and the crowns of Europe, Spain and Holland and so forth, before the United States existed. After the Constitution was ratified in 1789, Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution of the United States, right up front, is the Commerce Clause, the most litigated clause in the Supreme Court. But it also says, it's got the Indian part in it, it says, relationships between Indian tribes and the United States of America is the sole province of the federal government. States, counties, everybody, forget it. And just in case they didn't get it, in 1790, they passed the Non-Intercourse Act, which was reinforced in a statute in saying, so relations between Indian, so that's why, the treaties, so there's a sequence of jurisprudence in the United States. The number 1 documents the Constitution, the number 2 are treaties of the United States, and number 3 are statutes. So treaties have precedence over statutes. And the typical treaty between a tribe and the United States involves cessation of hostilities, creation of a reservation, oftentimes the provision of a healthcare worker because of the massive die-off that occurred after contact with the Europeans. It is the greatest, some people call it a Holocaust, the greatest loss of life in the history of the world in terms of percentage, so that many tribes were decimated and had mortality rates of 80%. So the Indians that are around today are our ancestors were wiped out. Almost, and so it was a very small proportion. But those treaties call for healthcare and oftentimes call for an educator. So there are so many treaties that call for a healthcare worker to try to help the tribes overcome now then, I can't help resist saying this, germ warfare was practiced against the tribes because the United States would take blankets off people that were suffering from smallpox and send them out to the reservations. So because of that history, and so many treaties call for a healthcare worker, the United States Congress created the Indian Health Service to do a holistic, programmatic way of dealing with Indian health. So the United States has spent a lot of resources on trying to improve the health care of American Indians, and our profile is pretty much the same as the United States at all. The number one killer in Indian country depends on age and gender and stuff, but it's heart disease. And the number two killer is cancer, and so forth down the line. It's got that parallel. And most families in Indian country don't have substance abuse problems, but the percentage of Indians that are alcoholic or have other forms of substance abuse are sometimes 3 or 4 times that of the United States as a whole. So it's a big problem, and the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration has spent a lot of money and resources on trying to prevent and treat substance abuse in Indian country. And one of the big things that goes together with self-determination is their finding is that culturally competent treatment is hard to find. It's best generally provided by the indigenous people themselves, and so that's a recognition of that, and that's one of the things that drew me into it. I think there's a parallel again, is in the sense that the pharmacotherapy that works in non-Indian communities works in Indian country. Although I think you really have to separate substance abuse from other mental health issues. I mean, I happen to be a strong critic. I know personally and from reading the literature on it that pharmacological treatments for many mental conditions, mental illness conditions, I mean, on the one hand has had dramatic positive effects, but is misused horribly in some cases, like in senior centers homes or in youth that are prescribed antipsychotic and anti-major depressant drugs who don't suffer from that condition and who may have a conduct disorder, and it's a crime. It's a crime the way drugs are misused. Psychotropic drugs are used in Indian country and outside of Indian country. But the big thing is I already alluded to already, which is using indigenous, native, culturally competent approaches for prevention of substance abuse and mental health problems like depression, which of course go together, as opposed to coming in and trying to treat Indians by somebody who comes to their culture and has no clue what the traditions are, how people relate to each other, and so tribes are taking over and playing a greater role. In fact, part of SAMHSA's substance abuse programs are earmarked solely for tribes, and that is part of the huge progress that's being made. I just read an article yesterday that was really fascinating, and it said 2 things. The first one is not surprising, but it was talking about adults being treated for major depression and treated with drugs. And typically in any treatment program, no matter what the condition is, the treatment works better for some people than for others. And for those people that the drug treatment worked for major depression now on this, had even a bigger effect on their children. The children did not receive any medication. It was the changes in their parents' depression which resulted in improvements on a number of domains of their children. I thought that was interesting. But the second part of the article was talking about a hyperthermia treatment for major depression, and they put people in an apparatus. Their head is not covered, but they just raise their temperature for a long time. Well, it's a short time, but and after very few treatments of that, there was some significant evidence of improvement, amelioration of the depression. The author pointed it out is that cultures all over the world have discovered that, and so one of the things that's happening in Indian country is it's the giving of it's not so much the importation of a treatment from the non-indigenous, but they're called sweats or sweat lodges, you know. Now, this is a case where when the tribes do it, it's really different. A fairly common is a sweat lodge, which has to be constructed, depending on the tribe, it has to be constructed in a certain way, out of certain materials. The door has to face in a certain direction, and the stones are heated in certain kind of ways. But basically, it becomes like a sauna bath. And there's prayers that are done and certain rituals that are done in there. Well, there's lots of places now that are non-Indian that are using sweat lodges, and it's that same hyperthermia approach which has some documented benefits for substance abuse treatment and prevention. Another thing that is done systematically in Indian country and everywhere is recognizing the role of trauma. That the trauma was experienced, whether it's physical, emotional, or sexual trauma or abuse, those incidents almost always took place before the embarking on substance abuse. An expansion of a holistic approach so that a person gets training that they need, they get a job that they need, they have their other physical needs to be met. Housing is a problem throughout the United States, but housing in Indian country is a nightmare. One of the values that many tribes is if you have a relative and they don't have a place to stay, you provide them a place to stay. It's just unacceptable to have it. So that results in a 2-bedroom house with 3 or 4 families living in it. HUD has a program that tries to address housing in Indian country, but it's limited by resources, and so this is not a new problem. It's ever since Indians started living in housing that's similar to that of other people in the United States, as opposed to Hogans and things like that, there's been this lack of housing problem. So you have to, and it's that way. It's not just Indian country; it's everywhere. You have to look at the needs that your clients have, and you've got to help them find solutions to those needs. So that's housing, nutrition, dealing with abuse that can be ongoing, and the neglect and abuse, and that holistic approach is what I want to see expanded. I sometimes admit to being a slow learner, and after I had worked in Indian country for 10 years, I finally reached that that idea that the lack of gainful employment is one of the critical problems. So I, together with some other people, founded an organization called Native American Capital. And Native American Capital is somewhere between a boutique bank and an investment firm that raises and deploys investment capital in Indian country. And you know, one of the challenges that we have in Native American Capital is that capitalism in Indian country is seen as something that came from the European experience. And the idea of creating a for-profit entity takes some persuasion. And my position, which I hold fairly strongly, and and it's growing, but the idea is that even if you run a nonprofit, you should run it as if it were trying to be for profit, because some huge percentage, certainly over 50% of all programs, even nonprofit or for-profit programs, at the end of 3 years don't exist, and that's true throughout the United States. So you have to figure out a way to be sustainable. One of the problems that has been with programs that are funded by the Indian Health Service or SAMHSA or other components of HHS is there'll be a grant, it runs for 3 years, it's not sustainable, good things happen, and then everything falls apart. And actually the results of that are worse sometimes than if they didn't have a program in the first place, because people's expectations start to rise, and then their hopes are dashed. So I advocate that. And so, for example, there is a tribe that was building houses that I'm forgetting the term of art, but they're housing. It was like a factory that built houses. I mean, it literally was a factory that moved through, and the houses were put onto foundations. So I mean, it's not mobile homes, and they were selling them like hotcakes. They were selling them to manufacturing them for their own tribal members. It's a large reservation. Other tribes were buying it, and non-Indian people they were running 2 shifts a day. And if it was up to me, I would have said put in 3 shifts a day. But they had 2 shifts a day, and everybody and their brother wanted to get a job. And they said, hey, my uncle's working here, can I have a job? And I was telling them, if you can do the same amount of work with 2 less people, you might want to do it through natural attrition, but you don't want to keep hiring people. I mean, that's what I say. What we need is jobs, but it's got to be sustainable. And if you're building anything and you can do it more efficiently, that's what you should do. That's a hard sell in Indian country. But I have a dear friend who's from one of the Florida tribes who has said to me, says, Walter, what a lot of people in Indian country don't get is just because you have a job doesn't mean you stop being an Indian. You know, but there's been so many generations of unemployment that there's not a lot of role models sometimes. But that's all changing, because now the policemen on the reservation are tribal members, and the doctors may not. Some of the physicians now, as more and more Indians get advanced degrees, some of the doctors are tribal members or members of other tribes. The dentists, the tribal. Some tribes have companies now, and are either creating or buying companies and hiring more and more people. So that's all changing. Native American Capital. It's an Indian-owned firm, and like I say, we raise and deploy investment capital. So one of the tribes that we've worked with is building tubs for. You may see the ads sometimes for older people where they have doors and stuff like that, so they can sit down. So there's the manufacturing processes, and but you know, one of the barriers to it is that water is the new gold, or the new petroleum. Tribes, the Navajo Nation has claims for all of the water of the Colorado River, which is currently split up by California and Arizona and New Mexico and Colorado. They're not going to get that, even though they have claim to it. It's not realistic to it. But there's other tribes that have claims to water, actually have the allocation, and don't use it all. So Native American Capital goes to them and says, we can help you sell that water to cities down the river. And there's some of the most traditional, respected tribal members say, but we're not using it. It's not ours. It's the Creator makes this water, and that other people can use it is good. To which I say, I'm a modified capitalist, I say, do you have the best school system that you could have? Do you have the best healthcare system? Do you have substance abuse problems? The answer to that is nothing's perfect, right? No, we could do better. And say, well, if you sold that water, you could then take that capital, because capital is like atomic energy. It's not good or bad in and of itself. It's what you use it for. So you should shoulds, that tongue, it's a moral judgment on my part, but you could take that money and improve the life of your members, tribal members, and of other tribes and intertribal relationships. Sometimes that's a hard sell because it goes against core values, which I hugely respect. I'm on the C4 board of directors. I sometimes use hyperbole, but C4 in many ways has changed my life. It's enabled, C4 has a long history of investment in indigenous cultures, and it's helped fund something called the Four Winds Indigenous Healers Project, which I'm active in, and I'm fortunate to have joined this organization.